Hey guys, welcome to the Lunge Lift podcast. Today we have a bit of a controversial episode for you that bodybuilding has no place in CrossFit. Hopefully that's triggered some people, but in the discussion, hopefully come out of the episode feeling a little bit more understanding to this statement. And hopefully that also gives you a little bit more clarity with how to use bodybuilding like training for the goals that you as an individual have without hurting your results. But before we get into it, as always, a big thank you to our show sponsors, thetrainingstimulus.com. If you work in the fitness industry and are looking to stand out, getting your clients better results using movement mechanics, please check out the website for details of the movement mechanics mentorship. wit-fitness.com. Please use our discount code LL15 to get 15% off your purchase. And Hydro, use our discount code LL20 to get 20% off your blood flow restriction apparel. Right, let's get into it.
Yeah, mate.
Rob,
Yes.
big one.
So this is massive for me because you do see a lot now bodybuilding work placed in CrossFit programming as a form of either like prehab to make sure the joints are feeling good, or just essentially some fluff work to either fill out a session or just essentially to make someone feel good, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which I think has a place. It does have a
Yep.
place as long as you're clear on what you're sacrificing to put that in place. And it has become really apparent to me when that IFBB pro Joe come down to March on and was dabbling into the world of functional fitness. So not quite CrossFit all the way, but
Mm-hmm.
functional fitness, where we do include some gymnastics, some more weightlifting style movements, and to see the limitations of a pro bodybuilder trying to take on these movement patterns and how to execute them efficiently, it
Mm-hmm.
was a massive eye opener to me. And it was fascinating
Yep.
because you see he moves so well through most movements, but he just targets the fuck out of the muscles, which within
Mm.
CrossFit, they're using so like as a wall ball. I'm not training it as a tempo squat and a tempo press. I'm trying to use as little muscle as possible. And to see him then try to do that, you can see the challenge that he was having to overcome. So what kind of triggered this for you?
Yeah. So I'll answer that in 1 second. But one thing I want to get on the table very early on is that this is not a hit piece on bodybuilders. It's not a hit piece on CrossFitters.
No.
They're two populations that we both have massive respect for in their own right. But what we want to do is clarify the distinctions between the styles of training so that each individual can get more what they want. And the reason, the trigger for this episode for me was a great YouTube video. I think it was on RP Strength with Dr. Mike Israel, who I'm a big fan of. And he was taking Rich Froning through a bodybuilding workout. And I think it just highlighted some of the key differences in terms of adaptations that each type of athlete has, and how different their training really is, and how one style of training isn't actually helpful for the other, and actually in a lot of circumstances can be detrimental to performance. Particularly bodybuilding can be detrimental for CrossFit performance, and we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of how that works. But a few interesting tidbits from that YouTube video. Dr. Mike got Rich and his friends to go through 5 sets of 20 tempo back squats, which, if anyone's done anything like that, is
Brutal.
absolutely brutal. But they weren't limited by their lungs at all. If anyone's done 20 rep back squats, they sometimes call them breathing squats because they gas you out so much because it's such big effort. But they're so fit that their lungs didn't actually limit their 20 rep sets across any of the five sets, which I think's nuts, because one set will usually gas
Yeah.
most people. Like, well, it could be the main part of a session. Interestingly, Rich, his lower back was blowing up in the squats, not his quads, even though the intended stimulus was quad hypertrophy from Dr. Mike, which speaks to a couple of the points we'll talk about later. Rich also really struggled to use tempo and pauses. He kept going a bit too fast and coming out of the pause too early, compared to his mate who wasn't quite so experienced in CrossFit or quite so good as CrossFit. And I thought that was a really interesting thing to note, because Rich is obviously incredibly strong, incredibly fit, but he just couldn't bear the tempo or the pause as well as a less strong, less fit guy. And I think that speaks to the efficiency with which he's used to moving. He doesn't usually move slowly, and he doesn't usually hang around during a rep, which again is very opposite to bodybuilding. And Dr. Mike also commented on the fact that he was very quick to revert to his sport technique. So when they were doing some air squats, he would again take the work away from his quads to use his glutes and lower back, because he's very strong in the posterior chain. So all these little things just got my brain working on something that I've been thinking about for quite a while, that there's some incongruency between this push to incorporate bodybuilding into CrossFit, and to me it just doesn't make sense in so many different ways. And yeah, we will get into the nitty gritty over this episode.
Yeah, I think, well, obviously the first thing is, why is bodybuilding shit for CrossFit? Because obviously we've discussed little bits there and kind of alluded to some of it, but why does a bodybuilder find it harder to get into CrossFit than maybe the other way around?
Yeah, good question. So I think the way we're going to break it down today is in three key categories, like in terms of exercise selection, exercise execution, and then the adaptations that you're seeking to drive from the above two. And I think the classic thing in bodybuilding, let's just start with one. Say you're training to grow a muscle, you're training to grow your biceps, you're looking to drive time under tension and metabolic stress in that muscle to make it grow bigger. And some of the best ways to do that are through tempo reps, long, slow, negatives, through pauses. And essentially, by keeping tension on the muscle, you're preventing blood flow out of the muscle, and therefore blood flow in. Well, the pump is more blood in than blood out, right? And that's why the muscle burns. That's why you get that pump, and that's one of the things that makes the muscle grow. In CrossFit, that's the opposite of what you want. You want good flow of blood in and out of the muscle throughout any competition. So in using your bicep, you're actually trying to use it in the lowest tension way possible to get the work done, to complete the task, to win the competition, but at the least cost to your body. So immediately we see there's a huge contrast in the way we're using our muscles, because the outcomes are very, very different. And when people start adding in bodybuilding into CrossFit training, they risk driving that adaptation for tension, for poor blood flow, which means they're actually exacerbating the problem of hitting failure in a local muscle during a workout. So that's just one to get us off the mark. But
for me, it's when I the big thing about the term bodybuilding is more the term, and I think I think because we try and put things into a box that we all understand. I think like what Sean said in the Zone 2 episode, where it's like heart rate zones are put there basically for our simple minds to put, okay, we're in zone 1, 2, 3. We don't want to have to think, what is this? And I think this is what's happening with bodybuilding and CrossFit, is that people understand kind of what CrossFit is to some degree. It's kind of everything except for bodybuilding. And bodybuilding is its own entity, because it's what most people go into the gym, even if they don't know they're doing bodybuilding. Most of the time they're doing bodybuilding, just probably poorly. So when this integration of bodybuilding and CrossFit starts to happen, I think the terminology of bodybuilding, of I'm trying to grow a muscle to make it bigger, is incorrect. Whereas if you're doing accessory pieces, maybe having better terminology for it gives you a better, I think even a better intent behind the execution of the work, the exercise itself, rather than just saying, I'm now going to do some bodybuilding work.
Yeah, spot on. I think that's really important to clear up the definitions, and that bodybuilding, the sport of bodybuilding, is essentially building your body. You're training hypertrophy to grow muscles for size, and size and aesthetics are not involved in CrossFit performance. And I think that's the simplest way to think about it. Why do you care about how big you are or how you look when your sport is about fitness, output, and performance? They're not related. they're not related at the end of the day. Like, it's not the person with the best body that wins a CrossFit competition. And I think the conflation of bodybuilding with accessory work makes things confusing, because for some people they'll say accessory work when they mean bodybuilding, and bodybuilding is always accessory work, when actually accessory work in bodybuilding might just be some isolation work. If you're doing a push day, your accessory work might be triceps, because triceps are involved in pushing because they're similar muscles. Whereas accessory work from a performance perspective is whatever is necessary to improve your sports movements. So if you're a power lifter, you might be doing some split squats to help your squat. And because split squats can be used in bodybuilding as well, it makes things super confusing. And I think you hit the nail on the head there by saying it changes the intent of the exercise, which speaks to our exercise execution point we'll get onto later, because you can have the same exercise be used for bodybuilding and performance, but the way you go about it should be entirely different if your goal is performance rather than hypertrophy.
Yeah, I want to quickly go back to the point where you mentioned there about the look of the physique as well, because I think if you look at the last 3 CrossFit Games male winners, and you go back to Rich Froning, so you look at, say, he had obviously a massive sporting background as a kid, as I've seen from like his documentary and stuff, but like a lot of his training probably started out a lot more bodybuilding, when we mean bodybuilding, actual bodybuilding, because this is what the knowledge was back then. You know, you should be doing bodybuilding to get stronger, you should be doing bodybuilding to get bigger, fitter, and all that lot. And so you look at his physique, then you look at, say, Matt Fraser's physique, which comes from a more performance background with accessories. So obviously coming from weightlifting, so he built a very dense physique and a very good looking physique. Then but it was smaller than Rich's. From, if you looked at, like, Rich looked a bit more like a bodybuilder compared to, say, Fraser, but then Fraser would look like a bodybuilder compared to Medeiros, because you look at him, he's come in now at a younger age of basically pretty much focusing on CrossFit, where then he's lacked time and attention. He's lacked basically a lot of, say, bodybuilding style work with a lot of pump work and stuff, and he's focused on performance, and that's why he's as fit as he is, and that's why he's as good as he is. But then you look at those 3 physiques next to each other, and I think you can see the implications of what CrossFit does to the body if you're trying to look good. Because I think, again, it's that differentiation of why are you doing CrossFit and why are you doing bodybuilding, and when you understand those two, you can understand if you should be doing bodybuilding as a CrossFitter and vice versa.
And I think that's a really nice illustration, because as the sport has got more competitive, the opportunity costs wasted gets punished more.
Yeah.
So if all else is equal and one person has spent a percentage of their training time on bodybuilding, but person B has spent that percentage of their training time on further performance training, if everything else is equal, the performance training guy is going to win. So I think over the next few years, you're going to see more and more athletes winning with less bodybuilder-like physiques, because there's just going to be more competition. So people who have dedicated to performance training sooner and not taken the indirect route via bodybuilding will actually have a competitive advantage, because they've got more training hours purely seeking performance than those that haven't.
Yeah, that just even got me thinking. Like, look at a footballer's legs. Like, they normally have great legs, and their upper body is it's all right. But like, unless you go to someone like, say, like Ronaldo or something, who probably actively trains his upper body with real intent. But like, you look at their legs and you're like, those legs are meant to do a job, and they do exactly that. But you could, if they took their shorts off and tensed them, they'd be quite close to like what most people would class as like a bodybuilder's legs. Not necessarily a pro bodybuilder, but they'd have good legs, like they'd have good muscle tone, something, because they'd be quite lean. So again, that perception of muscle mass, they would look better. And again, I think it's the understanding of the. Yeah, I don't know where I'm going with that, but basically, I just think about their legs, because I remember seeing Ronaldo's legs, and I was like, God damn! Like, you could see like the separation and everything. I was like, I don't know if my legs look like that on a bodybuilding stage, let alone fucking as a footballer. So, yeah, right. Well, we'll move on to the first part, which is obviously the exercise selection. Now,
yes,
we can break that down obviously into isolation versus compound lifts, right?
Yeah. I think so. The first thing to get clear on here is that there are no isolation movements in CrossFit. It's all about the task being completed, right? It's
Yeah.
functional movements, and it's supposed to have carryover to real world application. And in the real world, you're never training one muscle at a time. So that immediately off the bat, you're thinking, if I want to be good at the sport of CrossFit, I've got to be good at compound movements, not isolation movements. So there needs to be a really good reason to isolate a muscle. The justification most commonly given for doing muscle isolation work is that you're working the weak link in the chain, which I think is a valid justification for why you would want to emphasize the use of one muscle or muscle group over others within a compound movement. However, we'll get into the exercise execution shortly. The way that you do that has a huge impact on how much it will carry over to your compound movement. So if you're trying to improve your strict press, for example, everyone knows that your triceps are involved in your strict press. So it kind of makes sense to do some isolated tricep work so that hopefully your strict press will go up. That presumes you've identified your triceps as the limiter to your strict press. For example, if your shoulder stability is actually the limiter to your strict press and your triceps are more than strong enough to lift more, but they're just not given the opportunity because the foundation from which they operate is shaky, it's not going to do a huge amount to improve your strict press until you address the underlying shoulder stability. So first we need to accurately identify what the limiter is before we can target it. Secondly, the isolation, I like to use the analogy of the body as a team in sport, say a football team. The way the team performs most effectively is when everyone in the team is working together in harmony and everyone's pulling their weight, everyone's doing their job. So if you had 11 football players who all did all their training on their own, they're not going to have the same cohesiveness and teamwork as those that train together. So if you're trying to improve your press, I think of that as a sub team of the team. So you can think of like attack or defense. You want that sub team to still work together. So if you've identified the limiter in that sub team, so that movement pattern, how can you address the limiter while still keeping that teamwork within the sub team? So say you're a football team and your defenders are not very good at the offside trap because one guy is just not very aware. Teaching him about the offside trap, teaching him the strategy, what the signals are, when to do it, that will all help. But really, the offside trap in game is only going to improve if the back four, back five are able to coordinate together to do it. So if that tricep is the weakness, your press is only going to get better if that tricep learns to contribute more in conjunction with all the other muscles of the upper body involved in the press. So you should only train them on their own as far as really needs to be. If there's a real like weird situation where it's purely that, say that individual just doesn't know the offside rule, for example, but really it's the coordination between the different muscles is going to be the key to improving performance. And I think hopefully that illustration makes it make more sense as to why doing, say, like a dumbbell press or like a press at a slight angle where you emphasize the tricep, but it's still a press pattern, might be more useful than just doing like a rope cable tricep extension, which is a great bodybuilding exercise, but it doesn't look very much like a strict press.
Just took my my example I was going to give. But do you know what? I think when I think about that analogy that you say, I do like that one, and I then picture in my head how that would work using that offside trap as the example. Is in like if we've got one side of the pitch, the other side of the pitch, and so the left hand side has to tell the right hand side that they're going to start this offside trap, essentially, right? You want that line to be as straight as possible. So you want, as you say, everyone to be working all together so they're moving up as one. Whereas if you say have that one person lagging back, it's going to take longer for that signal to get back to that player and then come back to this one. And for me, like, I think if what you'd commonly hear or see is, okay, you want stronger triceps, I don't even think a dumbbell shoulder press would probably be some people's first point of call. It'll probably be something that's a lot more easy to do, like a tricep push down. And you're like, well, that's actually the complete opposite direction of where you want to be pressing. So, the actual sequencing of how to press is incorrect. So, okay, yes, that head of your tricep might start to recruit a little bit in an overhead press in some way, but you could be a lot more specific with your movement. And I know when we've gone back to previous episodes and like your spectrum of specificity, the further away we go, the longer it's going to take to get back to the actual strict press and the whole reason why you're trying to get stronger. And recently, where I've been dabbling into the old time strength lifts, I was doing a bench press yesterday. And what was really interesting about that was I had to get my body into a position, which is essentially like in a way, like a windmill, with my elbow tucked into the side and then pressing out. So I got better as the sets went on, as I started to understand the movement better. So when my body started to work together better, I was able to press out more weight. And so I failed 50 kilos a few times on my right. And it was just, and I was thinking about it, I was just like, why is this going wrong? And then as soon as I kind of got into a certain slightly different position and pressed through, I was like, bang, got it. So then, but if I would have failed that rep and left that session there and said, oh, I've got weak tricep pressing in that position, it's like, no, I just didn't know how to execute the movement as efficiently as possible. And this is where it's like, for me, this is why I've massively enjoyed some of this stuff, because it's the puzzle and trying to make it all work together to execute something. And when it comes to CrossFit, that was one of the things that drew me in, because there was so many movement patterns you had to learn and kind of undo all my bodybuilding background and say powerlifting, well, not necessarily powerlifting, but more bodybuilding background, where I had to learn to be efficient with pull-ups and move freely through the movement, where I'm, as you mentioned earlier, taking less time under tension on say, a pull-up. So I quickly then changed my exercises that I was choosing to improve my performance, which is obviously, when it comes to the exercise selection, is key.
Yeah, spot on. I think that bench press is a really nice example, because the limiter to your performance was not a single muscular strength. It's the power coming out of the movement pattern, and that's performance, right? It's how much power can you output from a pattern overall. And going piecemeal, muscle by muscle, is often not the way. Like if you think about any powerful sporting movement, they'll never train that in piece by piece, one muscle at a time. They train the movement itself. And like you said, we use the spectrum of specificity to basically try to get as much carryover as possible. So if you're trying to improve your strict press, why would you go one muscle at a time? There's like over 20 muscles in the shoulder. Why would you train them one by one when you can just improve the pattern more directly? So hopefully that makes a lot of sense on the exercise selection, like how you would go about choosing exercises better for performance rather than aesthetics. But go on.
So just I think just to summarize that little bit more. So like with the exercise selection, as in like in most cases, and this is how we want it to kind of lead into execution, is there's a blurred line between certain exercises, and there's a lot of exercises that you'd kind of have to question, okay, is this really something that's going to help? Like, even if it's like a compound movement that, a bench press, like using the bench press. So like exercise selection, like a bench press for CrossFit, probably it can be beneficial, because bench press does come up sometimes in competition. And just as a general rule of thumb, everyone should train a bench press in a nice horizontal pressing pattern, coming biasing from a powerlifter. However, when you watch a CrossFitter bench press, it's fucking terrible. I hated watching it at the games, because it is just like smash into the chest and just hope it comes back up. And it's like, it's literally the complete opposite of how I coach someone how to bench press, because they're literally, it's drop and hope. And it's like, you're hoping that you're going to bounce high enough off your chest that all you've got to do is a little tricep extension at the top. And I'm just like, it just makes me feel sick. But then you watch how a bodybuilder if they bench press, which isn't often. Most bodybuilders
Yeah.
would prefer to use, say, either dumbbells, machines, or something like that to actually grow their chest. But a bodybuilder doing a bench press, even if they are using a barbell, would actually position their elbow slightly differently. They're going to probably go to a different range of motion. So now this is where the exercise selection blurs with the exercise execution, because sometimes there is there is similarities.
Yes, spot on. So the exercise execution comes in for those exercises in the grey area where it does fall into bodybuilding, but it also falls into performance or strength training as well. And the bench press is a great example. Shout out to Josh Yanak, who brought this to my attention as a talking point. But the bench press for bodybuilding will be done very differently to the bench press for CrossFit performance. Like we touched on earlier, if you're doing a bench press to grow your chest or your triceps, you're going to try and keep the work on those target muscles and not give them a rest. So you might be doing partials, because for some people, when they go all the way to the chest, they lose the recruitment of the target muscle. And when you are very close to lockout, the biomechanics mean there's a lot less work being done by the target muscles. So quite often you'll see bodybuilders working in that middle range to just keep the target muscles under tension throughout the whole rep. In CrossFit, that's a no rep because you haven't touched your chest and you haven't locked out. So immediately you're breaching competition standards. Secondly, because you're keeping that work on the target muscles, they will fatigue sooner because they're not getting any rest. There's no reprieve where fresh blood can come in. So the byproducts of respiration, the burn, will build up sooner. So if you're doing a high rep bench press workout and you use a tempo, you are going to perform worse compared to somebody who is bouncing it off their chest and trying to minimize that time under tension. So even though the exercise has validity in both schools of training, the way that you do it will change significantly for the different goals. So if you're using bench pressing to improve your CrossFit, are you doing it because you're lying to yourself and actually just want a bigger chest? Or if you're doing it for CrossFit performance, you should really be doing it quick, trying to get strong in the movement and also enduring in the movement, minimizing time under tension, because that is the technique of your sport.
Yeah, and I think like even then when you say if you've done any tempo work, you'll know exactly these feelings, because like quite often I mentioned it in like the plyos episode with McInnes Watson, how I like using tempo bench press as either one post competition to kind of refine some technique things that maybe went wrong, or as a way to potentially like deload the body slightly, because you have to use lighter loads and you can then ingrain a really high quality movement pattern. So then when we start to then get a little bit more specific, we can then get more to the standards of whatever we're doing, whether it's CrossFit, whether it's powerlifting or bodybuilding. And I feel that when I get into like in my own training, when I'm doing bench press and I get to say my AMRAP set, even my AMRAP set, I'm still doing it specifically to how I'm supposed to be doing it. But then when I get to that point where I'm like, right, I know I'm not going to be able to pause on my chest anymore. I have the decision: do I want to keep it specific, or do I just want to now stroke that ego a little bit more and now start to bounce off your chest? Now that still has a place because I'm still overloading my muscle, not necessarily effectively for, say, the bodybuilding perspective, but as a performance of time under tension in general, I'm still getting more out of it. But I'm asking myself those questions and actually answering them, not just doing mindlessly. And that is the execution side of things, as we mentioned above, how there needs to be intent by what you're doing. Otherwise, you're just moving, and then you're spinning your wheels because you don't understand why you're doing what you're doing. And when you're trying to train for performance, the whole thing is measured based. You need to know how you're getting better. Otherwise, as I said, you're spinning your wheels.
Exactly. If your goal is performance, so you're trying to do maximum number of reps, you're not going to be doing tempo reps. If you look at the NFL Combine, where they have the 225 bench press test, no one's doing tempo reps there. They're moving as quick as they're allowed to move, right? And trying to minimize the time under tension. And Dr. Mike Isratil put it perfectly in that Rich and his mate move too efficiently for bodybuilding because they're always trying to get the job done as easily as possible. Whereas in bodybuilding, the technique is to move inefficiently so that you overload the muscle and stimulate hypertrophy. So in this simple example of the bench press, the bodybuilder is going to be moving inefficiently. So he hits that hypertrophy stimulus as soon as possible because that's what's going to grow the muscle, compared to the CrossFitter who's going to be moving as efficiently as possible so that he can do as many reps or as much weight as possible before his body gives out. And this we can apply to almost all overlapping exercises. Is your intent for the movement performance based, or is it hypertrophy based? And if you're clear on it, it will radically change how you should go about executing the exercise.
Yeah, and I think there's also like a slight grey area here where you've got, like, for instance, where we know bodybuilders like to obviously perform like with time under tension, like a lot of negatives to obviously create that muscle damage and the mechanical tension, but CrossFitters are generally trying to not do that. However, when CrossFitters are trying to build strength in a certain movement that allows some negatives, they can perform negatives to help build strength in that exercise to create more muscle damage. So it's kind of it's got that kind of crossover, because if we're trying to help someone do pull-ups and we say, right, you can perform negative pull-ups to help strengthen the movement pattern, it's kind of better. So this is obviously, you didn't know I was going to say that, so I kind of want to hear this, because in my head that's how I've just read what you wrote. And how do you respond to that?
Yeah. So negatives are a way to get exposure to higher intensities that you can't actually handle. So say somebody can't do a pull-up, they can't do the concentric, they might be able to do a negative. Mm-hmm. So it's a way of exposing the body to high amounts of tension. But the time under tension isn't the goal. It's the amount of tension that's the goal. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you're trying to develop the capacity to create enough tension in those muscles to pull yourself over the bar, but you can't create that tension concentrically.
Yeah.
You can create the amount of tension to support your body weight in a negative. And we go back to what you were saying about your tempo bench press. You can get exposure to the movement pattern and the skill at body weight, even though you're not actually strong enough to do it yet.
Yeah.
So the muscle damage isn't really what you're seeking in those negatives. It's just a byproduct. So when you're doing slow negatives for bodybuilding, you want to damage the muscle so it grows back bigger and stronger, primarily bigger.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're doing it for strength, it's more about exposure to the amount of tension than it is the muscle damage, which is why calisthenics guys will use isometrics as well. So you're getting exposure to the amount of tension without necessarily the ability to create the tension to start with.
And so obviously bodybuilders do that as well, obviously with isometrics and stuff. So just so this is also then for me, for clarity here, it's essentially the same thing. Technically, I know obviously the intent is ever so slightly different, but you're still getting the same response from performing the negative as a way to obviously load it eccentrically to get stronger, but then also you can load it eccentrically to help grow the muscle as well.
Yeah, but the tension. So let's think about this in a more practical application. If you're doing negatives for bodybuilding, you're going to be doing a lot higher volume. So you're not doing negatives because they're high tension because you're trying to get strong. Okay. You're doing it for volume, time under tension, and muscle damage. Whereas if you're doing it to get your first pull-up, you're not going to be doing 8 to 12 negatives because you can't, because you're not strong enough to. So you'll be working lower down at higher tension amounts. Does that make sense?
So it's essentially the same thing, so that it comes into the dosage, as in like how much of it you're doing, which is again what all of this kind of comes down to. Well, some of it comes down to. So I guess within that as well, kind of leading with from the negatives, bodybuilders a lot of time want to take things to absolute failure. So then they want to essentially annihilate a muscle where they can't then move it anymore to know. And they've gone through the most compound of movement all the way to the most isolated of movement to destroy that muscle. Whereas if you put that into CrossFit, that's essentially your body shutting off, because we're trying to use everything all together. So rather than taking your quads to absolute failure, would that be beneficial to help you, say, with your wall balls?
I would say no. So to get better at wall balls, you're essentially trying to do more without hitting failure. And for me, the easiest way to think about this contextually is in other performance sports, when would you go to failure? Like, when would you go to failure when you're running, for example? Only when you've just crossed the finish line. Because if you fail when you're running, you're not making any progress. And it's kind of the same in CrossFit. Is once you hit the point of failure, you're no longer scoring. You're no longer advancing through the race. So failure in bodybuilding serves the purpose of a very strong hypertrophy stimulus. But as we said before, hypertrophy is not in line with the goals of a performance athlete. It might happen incidentally, but it's not the goal itself. So, I think this is also illustrated in, I think we did an episode a while back on strength training. Pure strength sport athletes will very, very rarely hit failure because it's the skill of the strength and actually doing the movement. Whereas if you get to the point where you can no longer do the movement, you've probably created more damage, which is going to mean more recovery time before you can practice the skill of the strength again. So the role of failure in CrossFit training compared to bodybuilding training is much, much less, like closer to zero in terms compared to bodybuilding. You're looking to get very close to failure every set.
Yeah, that kind of makes me think about to like the aerobic capacity stuff of like, doing some movements and then trying to clear fatigue and stuff like that. So trying to then keep it in a similar movement pattern. And I remember it was like with on the bike, and then you'd get off and do some like alternating like lunges or some air squats. So like those sort of things can then help clear that fatigue, and then you can go back into it and do it as intervals to help build up your capacity. So
yeah, exactly. Like, so you want to keep outputting, right? You're training the skill of continuing to output. Whereas if you're doing that in a bodybuilding set, it would be a drop set that never ended.
Yeah,
and
which might be really good.
But the stimulus on hypertrophy, everyone kind of knows, would be a much less. Like you could bicep curl air almost indefinitely, and that's not going to give you big arms.
Well, yeah. I mean, I've seen someone curl like a 1 or like really light kilo weight, like little pink weight, for like hundreds of reps. So obviously, this is like hours of work. But then you get to the point where that 1 kilo starts to actually feel like shit. Whereas you could have done the same thing with a heavier weight and get there in 8 to 12 reps, which is kind of what the stimulus that we're after. So
exactly right. Yeah. Cool. So what else have we got? We've got momentum, another huge one. Bodybuilders hate momentum because it's cheating. You're getting other things but the target muscle to do the job. So it's not helping you with your hypertrophy stimulus, because the hypertrophy stimulus is target muscle working hard to force it to grow. Whereas in CrossFit, we're trying to use as much momentum as possible to achieve the task that scores us a rep. Classic example is kipping. So in kipping, we're using our whole body rather than any specific target muscle so that we can output more reps. So if you've got a half decent kip, you'll be able to do a lot more kipping pull-ups than strict pull-ups, because you're not limited by that local fatigue that you would be in a strict zero momentum pull-up. I think that one's pretty clear cut, right?
Yeah, and that's because it's like the number one thing that gets absolutely bashed on by, say, anyone not within CrossFit, is in, oh, well, look at the pull-ups that they're doing. I mean, it's stopped as much now, but it still kind of still gets, the first thing gets pulled up. Well, that looks stupid. You're not doing a real pull-up. It's like, well, there's a different reason behind
Chin's
it.
going over the bar.
Yeah, there's a different execution. So I guess that also kind of takes us into how bodybuilding doesn't really load the tendons and ligaments, and because obviously the whole stress is supposed to be within the muscles, and which is why when we look at some like IFBB pros, like the Phil Heaths and stuff, like we mean like the top level bodybuilders, like closing a car door and pulling a muscle, because like they've got such big muscle bellies that their tendons and ligaments can't handle the sheer size of their muscle belly, and it ends up pulling too much and ends up causing a rupture or something.
Exactly, yeah. So a good bodybuilding physique, like you say, is all about big muscle bellies. So the actual muscles themselves look good. And there's a much smaller emphasis on the connective tissue, so the tendons and ligaments. In the sport of CrossFit, there's a lot more load going through the tendons and ligaments, because you're hitting end ranges, you've got plyometric stuff, like double unders, box jumps, running. So if you're training the muscles out of proportion with the tendons and ligaments, you're going to get it's like a performance imbalance. It's not necessarily a motor pattern imbalance, but the tissues involved in the kinetic chain will have varying tissue tolerances. So you can imagine you can leg press the world, but your Achilles tendon hasn't had much stress placed upon it. If you go for a max set of rebound box jumps, your legs are going to be able to output loads and loads of force that Achilles tendon might not be able to tolerate. So by having this real muscle-centric approach to training, you're actually doing yourself a disservice, because the performance of your sport requires your connective tissue to be more proportionally trained with your muscle tissue, because again, it's the pattern, the power that comes out of the movement pattern that matters, not the strength in any individual muscle or even muscle group.
Nice. And then I'd say lastly, probably we've got some of the benefits of occlusion training. And obviously we've had Warren from Hydro on the podcast before, and we dived deep into occlusion training and how the benefits that they see going into some performance sports, like say football, boxing, bodybuilding. Like no, they're not necessarily going into the bodybuilding world, but bodybuilders have been using occlusion training for ages for the muscle damage effect, because of how much lighter they can go to get that. And a lot of the time it comes from injury. Let's say they're then trying to still get a big training stimulus, but their body can't necessarily handle the loading that it might be able to, because they might be coming back from injury or whatever. So what are your thoughts on like the occlusion side of stuff in training?
Yeah, so this touches on something this refers back to something we touched on earlier in terms of tension. So the way that you perform a bodybuilding rep, being slow, keeping tension on the target muscle, is a natural occlusion effect, because you limit the blood flow in the muscle, which means you're going to get a hypertrophy stimulus sooner, but you'll also hit failure sooner. So in bodybuilding, you're trying to maximize occlusion effects a lot of the time because it's hypertrophic, whereas in CrossFit, you're trying to minimize the occlusion effects, so you get free blood flow through the muscle, so it can be more enduring and output more reps. The performance use of occlusion is where it gets interesting, because you can simulate occlusion without necessarily creating the movement pattern without using a movement pattern that creates occlusion itself. Yeah. So you can do reps fast, like sports technique, but because you're using a cuff, you limit the blood flow. So the muscle will adapt to be able to deal with the byproducts of respiration and clear fatigue, as Chris Hinshaw would say, or deal with it better. But to be clear, in your sports performance technique, you want low occlusion. Like imagine trying to win a race when you've got a cuff around your thigh. That leg is going to blow up and fatigue very, very quickly. So this is old school, like endurance training used to do long wall sits. People might do like 10, 20-minute wall sits to build up tolerance to that burn, which is useful for endurance. But what you don't want is that burn to come on at all, really. Yeah. So you want to minimize that as much as possible. This is where people talk about lactate tolerance, where your ability to manage it will have a huge impact on how enduring you are in the sport of CrossFit.
Yeah, because what that makes me feel is like the ability to say then use occlusion, say straps, to say perform an air squat to get a similar sort of feeling into your quads that you would with a leg extension. So then when we're on the specificity of things, is that you can say, well, now I can create a lot more specificity and create more stress in an air squat and then get a similar effect as I would as in from a leg extension.
Yeah, so as a leg extension for hypertrophy, but you could use it in a CrossFit sense to get the feeling of doing 150 thrusters with an air squat and no weight, and in maybe less reps.
And a lot easier. Like, oh God, I thought doing that many. So I think that's that bit kind of covered. I mean, I think in summary, a lot of this stuff, but it's not fully finished, but in summary, if you want to get strong, you do strength training. If you want if you want to build a good physique, you do bodybuilding. And if you want to be good at CrossFit, size training, so hypertrophy shouldn't really be on the list of stuff to do, because it's just
Yeah,
not a performance metric at all. Like, you're not measuring your like your bicep curls. You're just not, unless you was then doing a 1RM bicep curl test if
yeah,
it was coming
exactly.
up in
And
the
that
games.
exactly. And like we said, that isolation movements don't come up in the sport of CrossFit. I think I want to go back to the strength, like in terms of the adaptations. The strength point, when people are using bodybuilding work to help develop strength, what they really mean is they're trying to address a strength imbalance, and the
Mm,
key word being strength. So if there's a weak muscle in the chain, they want to make it stronger and not bigger. So if you have identified that weak muscle, you're not going to be doing tempo reps and pauses and drop sets on it. You're trying to get it stronger and work at the speed of sport, I think is the phrase that I really like. So if you're trying to work that tricep, work that delt for your overhead press, presuming that it needs to be isolated, which as we said earlier, it might not, you want to be training it in the way that it's going to be used, which might be cycling shoulder to overheads, for example, because that's the sort of thing that CrossFit would demand. So I absolutely love the notion of addressing strength imbalances, but the way that you go about it, can it be more integrated into the movement pattern that you're actually trying to
mm.
improve, which we talked about before? Because if you can do it in a more similar movement, then you should. And I think we very quickly regress to real basic muscle isolation, which doesn't transfer through to sports movements nearly as much as just a variation of the core movement itself.
Yeah, I guess it's like going all the way back to like a leg press or a leg extension to get better at
Yeah,
squats.
exactly. Yeah, I think it's a classic example we've talked about before, where you see it in patella tendon rehab, where somebody will be prescribed leg extensions to load the patella tendon for squatting. But if the goal is squatting without patella tendon pain, the stimulus is loading the patella tendon and desensitizing it. Do we need to regress all the way back to a pure knee flexion extension exercise? Or can we get knee flexion extension in a squat pattern in a
Mm.
way that achieves that training stimulus? And this is where I'm a big fan of Knees Over Toes Guy, because that's one of the things he puts into his knee programs is backwards walking or the Poliquin step downs, where you're getting exactly that stimulus. You're loading the patella tendon, desensitizing it, thickening it up, making it stronger, but it's in a squat pattern.
Yeah.
So you're leaving less gaps to bridge between your like rehab and training. And I think the less gaps we can leave, the closer we are to training. And, you know, if somebody's a CrossFitter, there's never a case when they're going to need to do leg extension in the games, but there's going to be loads of cases where they're going to need to do a partial
Yeah.
triple flexion, triple extension, like just running up the stairs, right? So that that use of time, every rep of a step down is giving them the patella tendon stimulus they need, but also other benefits which will carry through to the sport much better. So if you can do that, you should.
Yeah, and I guess it comes down to like when if someone or something in particular is always getting injured, sometimes people just think it's that actually that muscle needs to be bigger to be able to work better, and so
Yeah.
that's why cool, I'm going to now hammer say my quads because they're weak as piss, so they need to be stronger quads. And so, what's your thoughts on that?
Might be. It might be that the muscle is getting is too weak. But I think we said before in the injury episode, basically the two ways something gets injured. Well, the only one way it gets injured is tissue tolerance gets exceeded,
Hmm.
and tissue tolerance can be exceeded because the pattern isn't great. So the motor pattern means that one player in the team is doing more work than it should, so it gets overloaded. The second is that the team is working perfectly, but it was just too much going through that individual at a moment in time. So this is more your acute incident, like a bad tackle in football and your MCL goes. It could be the MCL was too weak, or it could just be the freak circumstances, put too much through it at one point in time. And if you're always getting injured, that means the pattern is repeating, which suggests that unless you've been unfortunate to have multiple incidences of exactly the same tackle, and that does happen in some sports, but if it's something that's particularly self-inflicted over time, so every time you just do a squat program, you get the same issue, then it indicates there's something wrong with the pattern. So getting clear on what the limiter to the pattern is and addressing that with some targeted strength or performance work rather than hypertrophy work will be what gets you out of it ultimately.
Yeah, and I guess then the being bigger means you're stronger, and that's what obviously that obviously comes about quite a lot. So like people say, right, I need to be bigger now because I need to then have more strength to be able to lift more weight and perform better.
Yeah. So this is a good talking point, because a common phrasing is a bigger muscle has a bigger potential to be a stronger muscle, which I think is true if there are more motor units. But is that an indirect path is the question I'm asking. So if you spent months on a hypertrophy phase before going into a strength phase, would you end up being stronger than the person who just did pure strength work and ate the same amount? So if you're eating enough to fuel the growth, you'll get as big as you need to be for how strong you're asking your body to be. And I don't think, I have never come across any clear comparison. Like if you compared a powerlifter who just powerlifted his whole life against someone who did bodybuilding and then powerlifting, I think the powerlifter would be stronger because their training was always strength focused and they would get as big as they needed to be if they ate enough.
Yep.
Whereas the bodybuilder, presuming you ate the same, they've spent some time getting potentially bigger, but that time wasn't spent on the high percentage strength work, which might be the thing that gets them stronger. I'd love to have this conversation with somebody who might have more experience in it. But what do you think, having done both?
Yeah, cause it's funny because it was when I was reading like this point in particular, it got me thinking. Is like I put on body mass to move more mass, and it definitely helped me. But what I then asked myself is, even though it helped me, could I have done the same thing at a lighter body weight and just spent more time doing it? So, like, for instance, if I weighed 90 kilos rather than, say, 100 kilos rather than 110 kilos to perform a 300 kilo deadlift, I might have had to wait another year to get that 300 kilo deadlift for my body to build up the tolerance to lift that load and to build enough muscle tissue and resilience to that load to be able to lift it. Whereas then being an extra 10 kilos gave me a little bit more extra energy, a little bit more room for wiggle to allow the tissues to take a little bit more stress, and it enabled me to unlock it a little bit sooner.
Yeah.
But then it comes, I guess it then comes back
that's competition, right?
No, exactly. And it's like, I do all of my bodybuilding movements are bodybuilding movements. I don't really perform them as like accessory pieces a lot of the time, as like, you know, just going through the movement to try and get better at deadlifting. I'll try and do like a fucking single leg deadlift, say, or whatever. No, not a single leg deadlift, fucking a bicep curl with time under tension. Do you know what I mean? Because I want to grow bigger biceps. It's not going to do that to grow to help me build a bigger deadlift, even though my biceps are going to be part of the chain that correct. Well, actually, I try and make as little bicep as possible in the deadlift, but because I hook grip. So it's like I try to grow muscles for that reason, for purely aesthetic side of stuff.
Yeah.
But I do wonder, just because of the sheer size of me, that it has helped me be stronger.
Of course, like all things being equal, being bigger gives you the potential to be stronger. But the question I have is, say you've got a year, right, between now and a competition. You've got two people who are exactly the same. One of them starts with a hypertrophy phase to get big before they get strong. The other one just focuses on strength training all year. They eat the same. I think the person who does strength training all year will be stronger.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's the
Yeah,
movement pattern. It's
and
you're in,
exactly.
so it's like it's the reps of the movement. So of the squat. So rather than spending time on a leg press trying to get a similar movement pattern, I'm actually squatting with a barbell in my sport specific and actually getting better at the movement. Or within
Exactly.
CrossFit, is in like say I'm doing say front squats to improve my clean essentially because I'm trying to build up some squat strength there rather
Yeah,
than necessarily going to do a leg press to build up my leg strength, ready to do some cleans and some front squats. I'm actually just staying in front. So yeah, I agree.
yeah. I think it's yeah. And if anyone's got any differing opinions, we'd love to chat to you, because I think it's an interesting topic in and of itself, of
Yeah,
just kind of periodization, because a lot of powerlifting programs will have a hypertrophy phase built in, but I see that more of as a skill development
I
phase
do.
than a
I,
hypertrophy phase.
as a powerlifting side of
Yeah,
stuff, like I often have sets at 8 and say in at the start of someone's phase, mainly be and like we say a barbell back squat, mainly so they start to understand the movement itself for high reps at normally a lighter weight, so the risk
yeah,
of damage, the risk of injury, and all that lot are reduced quite greatly, while they're then building the reps on reps on reps skill. So
yeah,
but I think like one of the things that just kind of going back to the part about being bigger, like the thing of having extra mass, of having more weight to carry around, which means more
mm,
oxygen is required, and I've been burning out faster, is exactly
yeah,
what happens with me. It's
yeah,
like when I think back to our VO2 episode where we started to do, it's like you could just see how I just burnt out so much quicker. But and then if
exactly.
I did a max out sprint test, I'd be sweet, just getting that sheer size and power that I can put down. But when it comes to then actually any type of ability to utilize oxygen to its best potential, I'm fucked.
Yeah, and this is huge actually. So for every bit of muscle gained, it's mass that you have to carry around with you. CrossFit has loads of body weight movements, so actually there's no benefit to being heavy, bar the big cardio machines, like you say there. If you're heavy on an assault bike and on a rower, then it does help. But in everything else, when you have to transport your body, the lighter you are, generally, the better you are. So the balance is essentially how much mass and muscle is necessary to perform strength wise at your desired level. And it should be no more than that, which is why there is a kind of a ceiling that you don't get many guys over 95 kilos. Like the heaviest would be about 100. Once you go heavier than that, it becomes a massive disadvantage. So you want strong performing muscles rather than big muscles when it comes to the sport of CrossFit. And like you said there, the bigger it is, the more oxygen it requires. So your burn rate is higher. So you need a more developed aerobic system to just support your mass, whereas a lighter person requires less oxygen, which is why VO2 max is always measured against your mass.
This just reminds me of like whenever you're like watching the CrossFit games or something. Like, this is where like the specialists come in, like the strength specialists,
Mm,
where they're not quite the endurance kings or queens, and they're oh
yeah,
here we go, they now got a barbell to move around. The big guy, it's like well yeah, he's gonna have some drawbacks across the board because it isn't like I know when I was doing CrossFit and I was weighing in my like early 90s. Doing a load of butterfly pull-ups was a lot less strenuous on my arms, my whole body, let alone my biceps. And at the moment, if I try and do some butterfly pull-ups, because my skill of it has fucking depleted, the stress on my biceps, just of like 100 something kilos, oh, it's brutal. But
yeah,
I think takeaways of all this, because we like, I think to summarize it all, is like, if you're serious about CrossFit, you should look at your program and start to understand if there is bodybuilding in it, why?
yeah.
How could you be spending time doing something else to actually get you better at the sport of CrossFit compared to just looking good, looking like you're better at the sport of CrossFit?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's very, very, very important, because then you can decide on you can pick your exercises better, and you can execute them better. And I think when you do see the bodybuilding in CrossFit programs, if the intent is to address strength imbalances, then execute them accordingly. So you won't be doing like classic bodybuilding hypertrophy work. You should be trying to address the strength imbalances. So can you make it a little bit more like the movement you're trying to get stronger in, and what sort of style of rep are you going to be doing? Are you going to be doing tempos and pauses? If you need the positional work, maybe you can do that, but otherwise it should match the way that you're executing your core movements.
Yeah. So like, I'm just trying to think of an example. Like, say, for instance, I was doing bicep curls, and we're going to kind of revert back to bicep curls. I'm not really going to have much of a pause at the top, pause at the bottom. I'm just going to kind of go through the movements, like maybe together or unilaterally, and just kind of go through the movement and just build up some stress there. Yeah. Is that what we're?
Well, if you're so, I don't condone bicep curls.
I know you don't. I'm trying to put them in as much as I can.
Yeah, I think
I'm trying to help you guys.
To grow big arms,
Yeah.
and I will occasionally do some bicep curls, but I'm not kidding myself that it's going to make me better at CrossFit. But that's kind of it. Like if you're in CrossFit and performance training, you're trying to get as much work done as possible. So the way that you execute movements should be done with that in mind. So moving the most mass or doing the most reps is what you're optimizing for. You're trying to move efficiently rather than inefficiently. So when you're addressing these imbalances, it's about moving efficiently through the movement. So the classic one I might give somebody is the lateral press to overhead, where you're kind of getting a lat stretch while you're doing a press pattern to get people to use their lats better while pressing. What they're not doing is really getting a strong mind-muscle connection and tensing the muscle throughout, keeping tension on and going super slow tempo in both direction. They're just doing a press pattern, and through the setup, we're getting more lat recruitment, which means the pattern will be better and more powerful when it comes back to the normal overhead press, but we're not looking for lat hypertrophy in that movement. Hopefully that illustrates it a little bit better.
Yeah, and I think what's really key about this episode is that you can blend the bodybuilding and CrossFit, and you don't need to only be a bodybuilder or a CrossFitter, because a lot of people do have a blend of goals. They want to be able to move well and look good, and that's completely fine. And there's a lot of ways of doing that. But if you are trying to get better just at performance, and I do think like kind of coming into the sport of CrossFit with a bit of a background of some sort of strength training in general, I think will matter. Well, look at Matt Fraser. Like, look at how good he was coming from such a strength-based background of Olympic lifting. That I think would be good. But then as a bodybuilder coming in where the strength wasn't the goal, it was just to look a certain way, and now you have to actually use those muscles in a pattern that is not necessarily for a strength is going to be tough.
Yeah. I think it's clear that I echo your sentiments there, in that it's absolutely fine to want a bit of both and choose a blend of aesthetic goals with performance goals. This episode is mainly for the people who are clear that performance is their priority, to not fall into the trap of getting dragged into doing a set of bicep curls with Rob at the end of your session, because that's not actually going to help you. Like, nobody didn't go to the games because their arms weren't big enough. So you should bear that in mind when you're making decisions about your training. If you want to look better, that's absolutely fine. Go for it. But having a better understanding of the distinctions between hypertrophy work and performance training will mean that you can more accurately get what you want out of your training and not fall into the pitfalls where you can actually be hindering your progress, which I think is the biggest travesty in all of this, in that somebody could be thinking they're doing really good productive work, loads of hypertrophy, time under tension, and they'll end up finding that, say they're doing all these bicep curls, they'll find that their biceps actually burn out faster in their butterfly pull-ups because they're used to just generating loads of tension and restricting blood flow. So in that instance, you've hurt your performance rather than helped it, even though you thought that bodybuilding might be a good idea.
Yeah, and I guess obviously all of this boils down to that thing of specificity. Oh, how have I fucked up? I can say it all the time now. Now I can't say it. Specificity. Oh, fuck it. I've still fucked it up. Anyway, specificity. Here we go. You do what you need to do, and your body will adapt. Whatever it is, it will always adapt.
Exactly. Yeah. The more specifically you can impose a demand, the more specifically your body will adapt.
Exactly. So if you want to do your bodybuilding, do your bodybuilding, but don't expect it to get you better at CrossFit. pretty much the summary of today's episode. So we hope you enjoyed today's episode. And if you would like to kind of come back at us with any retaliations, we would love for you to come on the podcast, because we think it would be a really good conversation, and mainly because I would love to be told that I should be doing bicep curls to get better at keeping pull-ups. And so I hope there is someone out there that could please come on and tell Ash that he's wrong. But thank you very much, as always, for giving us your time. We really do appreciate every single week, and we hope this episode has made your training that little bit better. So thank you very much. We'll see you next week. Have a great day.
Cheers, guys.